I remember one senior partner saying to me in those first few weeks, never underestimate the value that you bring to us because you've had a different path. And, I felt a huge imposter syndrome being there at that level, not having done that type of job before. But there was just a lot of support once I'd got there, which was fantastic.
I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, a podcast committed to revealing the richness and diversity of the world of investment by focusing on its people and their stories. I'm joined today by Geri Mahon, who is a partner at AON and co-head of responsible investment at the firm. She started her career at PricewaterhouseCoopers in Sydney and spent time as a fixed income trader before moving to a healthcare technology business and ultimately moving to AON in 2018. She wrote a powerful LinkedIn post about returners, which led me to want to find out more about returnship programs and their value. In 2019, she was awarded the Most Inspiring Returner at the Professional Pensions Women and Pensions Awards after her first year returning. Welcome, Geri. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, let's start with your background. Can we go back to where you grew up, what you studied, and how you came to enter the world of finance?
Sure. So I'm half Chinese and half Australian. I was born in Sydney, but then my parents moved to Hong Kong when I was 2, and I finished primary school there before returning to Sydney, where I finished high school and then went to uni. My career roadmap probably goes back to when I was around 15, and I received some excellent advice from my dad. He told me and my younger sister to work hard to become financially independent as soon as possible, so we would never have to depend on any man. I really took that on board. I thought about what I liked studying, what I was good at, and what course would help me to achieve that goal. And I ended up studying a Bachelor of Commerce and Bachelor of Arts double degree at Sydney Uni, majoring in economics, finance, and Chinese studies. In fact, I initially started with a major in computer programming, but in those intro to programming lectures back in 2001, it was about 999 men and me, and that put me off a bit. So I dropped programming after the first semester and switched to economics and finance. And once I graduated, I got a grad job in assurance at PwC in Sydney.
And did you ever use your Chinese language in the context of business? Because I would imagine then as in now, that was quite an intriguing combination.
I haven't actually, interestingly, but I do hope at some point in the future I will have to. And I think it's important for children these days to be learning Chinese, actually. So it's something I'm pushing for at my children's school, because I think it's going to be important for many of us to be able to speak Chinese in the future.
And let's talk about some of the twists and turns then, because fixed income business into healthcare technology and now AON and a sustainable investing focus. Can you talk us through how some of those twists and turns worked out?
Yes. So I spent my graduate year working in that role at PwC. But at the end of that year, I applied for a role at ABN AMRO Bank on their global markets trainee program, which I was successful in getting. That was a 1-year rotation program. So I got to work in different areas of the bank, including in market risk, which was on the trading floor. The head of market risk used to give every trainee a challenge to build a discount curve. Now, I did advanced maths in high school and I loved maths, so this was right up my street. And in fact, I accepted that challenge on a Friday and I spent the weekend working on it and produced it on Monday. And I ended up building a swaps pricing model using it. And I know that's quite technical. A lot of people listening might not be able to understand what that's all about, but I think you probably do. And because I'd done that, he introduced me to the guys, and it was all guys back then, working on the swaps trading desk. And they ended up offering me a permanent job at the end of that year, that trainee year, trading Aussie and Kiwi interest rate swaps and government bonds. So I spent 4 years doing that in Sydney before moving to London with a new firm with Bank of America Merrill Lynch, where I traded those same products, but I was servicing the European client base in this time zone. A lot of people ask me what it was like on the trading floor, and I think people think it sounds really glamorous. But for anyone who's seen that series Industry on BBC, it was exactly like that. It was a really difficult cultural environment, especially for a young woman. I know there are more diverse teams now, but I never worked directly with another woman in my team in that time. So I spent 8 years at the trading floor in Sydney and London with no real role models. In 8 years, I never worked directly with another female trader. There was no other woman doing my job that was senior to me, older than me, and certainly no one who was a mother who was doing it. It's really true, that saying that you can't be what you can't see. I never considered that to be a job that I could do long term, even though I was good at it. And to be honest, it was a really difficult environment for me to be in on my own. So I ended up leaving. And after 8 years, the day I resigned, my boss said to me that he couldn't ask me to stay. He said, the changes that you need to see, I can't guarantee are going to happen anytime soon. And I wouldn't want my sister or my daughter to work in an environment like this. So I can't in good faith ask you to stay. So that said a lot. And one of the reasons I'm so passionate about inclusion and about diversity is because I don't want any of the young people in my team to have an experience like that. I want everyone to have role models, to see themselves represented, to really believe that they're capable of progressing to the highest levels within any organization. So after that, I had a few months off, and then I did the typical thing that all traders do when they burn out and leave. I joined a startup. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about that today because I'd be talking for hours, but suffice it to say, it's a health tech company founded by my husband, who's a very clever biomedical engineer. And I also had my first baby during this time. And because my husband and I were essentially running our family business, I didn't get to have much mat leave, and our little business couldn't afford to pay me anything on top of the government statutory pay, which wasn't much. So I only had about 3 weeks off after giving birth before I was doing the monthly management accounts for the business again. And anyway, after spending 4 years working on that business with him, I decided it was the right time to resume my career in finance, and I hoped that there'd been some change in the time I'd been away. And this is where it starts to get a little bit sad. We hear all the time that city firms are unable to recruit women at more senior levels because they just don't exist. And everyone agrees that this is an industry-wide issue. But when I tried to return to the city after 4 years out, it felt like mission impossible trying to get a job. I tried everything. The first thing I did was apply online for jobs, and I applied for what felt like 100 jobs online, and I got automated rejection emails for every single one of them, which was very demoralizing. I then started to reconnect with the recruiters I spoke to when I was a trader. However, none of them knew what to do with me, given I had a big, ugly gap on my CV. It wasn't empty, it just didn't say the right things. I developed a huge amount of new skills, but I didn't fit the template that recruiters search for. And once I finally managed to get through to a recruiter or hiring manager, a lot of assumptions were also made by them about me. And I'll give you an example of some of the comments I received. So one said, they want someone committed who isn't just looking for a cruisy 9-to-5 role that doesn't conflict with childcare. Another said, sorry, we're looking for someone who can hit the ground running. And another one said, they didn't want someone who only wanted to work part-time. And I mean, I work full-time, so...
Wow. I just have to stop you there, because that is, extraordinary, because I think what is so alarming is that is what is being said. We don't even know what's not being said, because perhaps there was what's being taught or what goes into decision making that's not even being articulated like that. Yeah. So, wow.
Yes. I know. And eventually, after speaking with 5 different recruiters, none of whom could help me, the 5th one recommended I speak to a specialist executive search firm that places experienced professionals like me back into the city following a career break. And that recruiter, who is a woman, she explained to me that the applicant tracking systems for all of those other jobs I applied for online, they couldn't cope with my CV because it was non-typical. And the way she describes the problem is that we have all these city firms saying, we're trying really hard, but there just aren't any women to recruit. And then you have all the women like me saying, I'm here, I'm applying, I'm trying really hard to connect with you. Why can't you see me? So within a week of my first meeting with her, I had 5 interviews set up. So that, she changed my whole experience. And even though each of those firms I interviewed with had thought outside the box and taken the positive step of engaging a specialist recruiter to connect with people like me, to find people like me, the experience I had with AON, which is where I work now, was different to the other firms. I think they put a lot of thought into who would interview me. My interviews with the other firms were all with men in senior roles. However, with AON, I met with 4 partners in the investment team, 3 of whom were women, but all of whom were parents. So immediately I had the role models and that representation that I'd lacked throughout my career. And they didn't make any assumptions about the type of work schedule a new mother might be looking for. And they offered me flexibility in how and where I worked. And this was back in 2018. I remember one of the guys I interviewed with at one of the other firms asked me if he thought the reason why there weren't more female traders was because most nurseries only open at 8:30. And as a trader, you need to be at your desk earlier than that. I'm sure you have a few thoughts about that, Ethan. So anyway, I accepted a job at AON as an investment consultant, and I joined the responsible investment team, which was a much smaller team 4 years ago, but has grown so much since then. I co-lead the responsible investment team now, and I was promoted to partner last year. And when I look back, sometimes I think it's a miracle that I got this job, but I did. And I do work full time, and I work really hard, as we all do. And I have an amazing, much expanded team now.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, there's certainly a lot to unpack there. And I can see from your experience that the problem is multi-layered, and it seems like it should be an easy solution in terms of a recruiter that is putting talent together with opportunity and framing it correctly. But I guess it's easy, but somehow it's not being done more frequently. Let's talk about returnships overall, because we didn't even have this word perhaps 10 years ago. How do returnships look like? Does the candidate go back into something equivalent like an internship, essentially almost like a training, a sampling role? Is it a finite time period? And with a view to then transitioning to something more permanent? How do you think returnships work or should work?
Well, that's exactly what it is. It is like an internship, but for an experienced hire that hasn't perhaps done that role before. So when I joined AON as an investment consultant, I hadn't worked in pensions or consulting before that, and I joined as an experienced senior hire. I had a period of 6 months initially. That was the sort of trial period. And at the end of that, I was offered a permanent position. So there was an acknowledgement that I wouldn't be hitting the ground running. I'd never done that job before. And actually, I'd been doing something very different before I came to AON. Everyone understood that. Everyone was really supportive. And I remember one senior partner saying to me in those first few weeks, never underestimate the value that you bring to us because you've had a different path. And, you know, I felt a huge imposter syndrome being there at that level, not having done that type of job before. But there was just a lot of support once I'd got there, which was fantastic.
So the LinkedIn post that you wrote that drew me to you about returnships, can you speak about any reaction you had to that?
Yeah, so we decided to partner with the Diversity Project Women Returners Scheme to offer returnships at AON. And I wrote a post on LinkedIn about my own experience to promote that. I was completely overwhelmed by the response it got. About 50,000 views, 500 reactions, so many comments and messages from people I've never met saying they were going through the same thing, experiencing the same challenges, and thanking me for giving them hope. I hadn't realized how many women were struggling to relaunch their careers and how many needed to hear a success story. It's clear that there are many women, and men for that matter, looking to return to work after a break for lots of different reasons. So it's not just that they took a bit of extended time to care for their children, but some of them may have gone back to uni to get a PhD or started their own business. But I think what that response to that post really highlighted was the need to think outside of the box, to tap into this group of people if your firm is lacking diversity at its more senior levels and you want to bring it in.
And you mentioned imposter syndrome, but I think that's probably only one of many of the perceived weaknesses that a returner might feel. They may feel that they've lost their network or that they're not up to date on the latest technology or that they don't talk the talk, or they may be wary of a bias perhaps against them because of their family situation. How do returnships tackle some of these?
Yeah, I think it's really not making assumptions about people. As you said, 4 years ago when I joined as a returner, returnships weren't really a thing, but now more and more people are hearing about them and considering them. And I think what's really important is that when you commit as a firm to doing this, You don't expect that someone returning after a break is going to hit the ground running. But it's also important not to make assumptions about someone's level of ambition because they've had a career break or because they're returning to work to a part-time job. It might be that it takes a few months for them to get back up to speed or learn about how to do that job. But it's not the first job they've ever had in their life. And actually, after that initial settling in period, they may then want to move into top gear and be very engaged and very energized with regards to progressing their career. I also think this is a wider issue that affects not just women, but anyone returning to work after a period of absence. And that could be, of course, because of illness as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose it's about framing our expectations. I mean, I suppose when somebody starts a new position, typically it is a stressful endeavor. It often involves a lot of high energy to establish networks, establish goodwill, get on the learning curve. And maybe a returner doesn't have necessarily the capacity to apply that level of energy at the beginning. So I suppose it's about, on the employer side, reframing expectations as well. But also the trade-off is perhaps the maturity and the life experience that person brings. Do you think that they work well in every field? Law, finance, trading, consulting?
I would say I probably can't say based on my personal experience because I've only worked in this field, but I don't see why not. I mean, the woman who hired me said, I just looked at what roles we needed to fill, and then I engaged that recruiter to find candidates who could fill that role. It wasn't, I looked at where we'd have space for someone to do a part-time role. And it's going back to that piece about not making assumptions. Just look at what roles you have to fill and then try a different path to try to find different types of people to fulfill that role.
And it's interesting that you found your niche in responsible investing, because that is obviously a fast changing area that is relatively new, I suppose, on the finance landscape. Maybe it's a particularly good area for returnships to tackle, given that everybody's on the learning curve and coming with a body of knowledge is not necessarily a prerequisite.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of on-the-job learning, but I would say the same thing, to be honest, for when I started my career in trading. I didn't study anything to do with that at uni. I mean, I did economics and finance, but no one can prepare you for what it's going to be like when you start in a job like that. And certainly in consulting, what I've realized is that it's all about relationships. It's about having people skills and how you manage a group of people within a room. And that's actually more important than the technical stuff, which you can learn anyway, you can read about. But it's about having those skills to manage a room of people and help everyone to come to a decision as to how they're going to move forward.
Talk about diversity more broadly now, because you obviously have experienced this throughout your career, from the trading floor right through to your current role, experience what it's like perhaps to be underrepresented. What are your thoughts on the current levels of diversity in your field now? I'm thinking particularly around parents, working parents, mothers in particular. Any thoughts on how the industry has changed?
Yeah, I think there has been change, but I think we still have a long way to go. I do think interventions such as gender pay gap reporting that we have here in the UK have had an impact because they focus people's minds on trying to find out what the problems are that are stopping certain groups of people from progressing. And it's not about giving women or mothers an easier ride, but about removing the barriers that are currently in their way. And I think, to give an example, family-friendly policies such as equalizing parental leave and benefits for all new parents are going to go a long way towards addressing gender inequality. And I actually think this is one change that firms can make that is going to have one of the biggest impacts towards reducing the gender pay gap. And I really hope to see more and more firms adopt that policy in the coming years. Another thing I'm really passionate about, other than talking about women and mothers, is disability inclusion, actually, because it's something that not enough of us are talking about. There's not nearly enough focus towards, and it's something that's very close to my heart. So I used to think I knew all about diversity and inclusion. I thought I was the expert. And then 2 years ago, I hired a graduate who has a significant visual impairment. And I realized that I knew nothing. I knew nothing about accessibility. It's just not something I'd ever considered for all of my good intentions. I mean, do you know that less than 20% of people in the UK who have a significant visual impairment are employed? That's a shocking statistic. And I didn't know that, but I do now. And I know the reason that they're not in work is because work is simply not accessible to them. So I've been working hard with my team to ask questions, to listen and to learn. And through that, we've been working on making work accessible for my colleague. So a long way to go, a lot of learning to do.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And we've actually been featuring a number of guests with visual impairments on the series this year. And obviously technology has come a huge way and it's continuing to make access more and more possible. But equally, I think the framing of a person with disability as being less capable is extremely unfortunate. One of my guests reframes it as, instead of saying persons with disability, he says persons with determination, because obviously having to overcome so many setbacks already and still want to pursue a career, there's a massive amount of determination and ability there. So it's important to really focus on that. And thanks for the work you're doing around that. We were speaking about some setbacks and challenges earlier. What would you say were your key takeaways from that and how that could have made you pivot, maybe rethink things?
Someone asked me recently about what advice I had. What is the key advice I had for people trying to relaunch their career? And rightly or wrongly, the advice I gave was to never give up despite all the setbacks, because there will be setbacks. But I think what I've really learned from all of this is that we're not broken. I'm not broken. The system is broken currently, and there are lots of people working to fix it. But whilst it's broken, it's easy to feel like you're the one that's broken. So it's to keep going, learn from every setback, don't become disheartened by it, and keep going. And I'm someone who doesn't like to hear no from anyone. So I keep going and I receive a lot of unsolicited advice. I take on some of it and disregard, other pieces. But I just think believing in yourself and just keeping on working at it, working towards the goal.
So that is so empowering. And I can refer our listeners also to your Instagram Live that you did with the recruiter that actually helped to place you, I believe. And that was obviously very insightful in terms of how we can kind of plug that gap that is currently there for women who want to return to the workplace, for anybody who wants to return to the workplace. How about any investment mistakes that you've learned from?
So from a work perspective, I would probably say being too short-term in my approach. And I found that whenever I've reacted to an event in the short term and not stayed true to my long-term views, that's normally not produced the best outcome. I've learned also that it's so important to listen to people who have different views to yourself. And this applies to so much more in life, I think. Even if you don't agree with someone, it's really important to be open to listening to their perspective. And then from a personal standpoint, I think one thing a lot of us working in finance are guilty of is neglecting our own personal investments. And that was certainly the case for me. I hadn't really focused on my own personal portfolio until a few years ago, actually. And I feel embarrassed to say that. But when I was on maternity leave with my second child, before he arrived, when I was waiting, I worked with my husband to restructure our personal investments. And we call it the World in 2050 portfolio. We think about what the world's going to look like in 2050. And we've tried to invest in the companies, the sectors that are going to be successful because they're delivering the solutions that we need to get to what the world needs to look like in 20 years' time. And we don't worry about market volatility in the short term because our time horizon is long. So I've tried to really, really apply that long-term approach to my personal investments.
I love that. Well, we'll get you back for another podcast just to discuss that world in 2050. My last question is about mentorship and any key people. You mentioned some of this unsolicited advice. Did you find that role models and mentors were important as you charted your career?
I think they are really important. And I think I struggled a lot because I didn't really have them, if I'm honest. When I think of people who've actually influenced me in my career, in my life, I would cite my dad for giving me that early advice. I mean, what a legend, having the foresight back then to give his two daughters that kind of advice about working hard to become financially independent. And also my husband, when I was in trading and scared to leave the security of that job, he convinced me that it was okay to do so. And actually it was better to try to change my career before I became too senior in my role because it would be harder to do so after that. And he does a lot more of the home admin than I do right now. Most of the nursery and school pickups and drop-offs, arranging play dates, arranging birthday parties, there's no chance I would have been so successful progressing my career the way I have over the last few years if he hadn't taken on more at home. And because I've lacked sort of, from a career perspective, I've lacked those role models. I do have actually some of the young people who've come into my life have had a tremendous impact on me instead, such as Richard, who's my colleague who's blind. And he and I like to joke about how my eyes have been opened by the experience of managing him. And I actually feel empowered by having the awareness that there's still so much that I don't know. And I know it's okay to make mistakes as long as you keep asking questions and listening and keeping an open mind. And I really think the worst thing you can do about something is nothing, because you're scared of doing or saying the wrong thing.
Well, thank you so much, Geri. You may not have had many role models, but you have certainly become one. And I really appreciate your openness, vulnerability, and self-awareness in this discussion, because this is probably the most important time to have this discussion. We have the Great Resignation. We have a massive skills gap. We know we need to improve governance and improve diversity in our field as well as in many fields. And it doesn't seem like it's an insurmountable obstacle. So I think having guidance like this and examples of success are so important to assure everybody else on both sides, the employee and the employer, that it can be done. So thank you for coming here and for showing us part of the way.
Thank you so much.
I'm Aoife Devitt. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear more inspiring investors and their personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organisations and affiliations of the host or any guest.